Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some examples on how and why we like to simplify at times in chess. What are the circumstances when we are looking to trade pieces to simplify the position? Well, the most common situation when we do want to do that is when we are ahead in material. We are up a bishop, a queen, a pawn, anything. Usually it's to our advantage to trade pieces, to trade queens or other pieces. Another situation may be that we are able to transpose to a technically easily won theoretical endgame. And yet another situation may be when we are under heavy attack and we may have material or strategical advantage. And all we need to do is to survive the attack, and typically the easiest way to accomplish that is if we can trade queens or some other pieces to get rid of our opponent's attacking pieces. Let's start with a famous game by the Cuban former world champion José Raúl Capablanca against Ragozin at the famous Moscow tournament in 1936. Here we go. They have reached this position where white is a pawn ahead. However, the white bishop on a7 is in an unpleasant pin, meaning the bishop cannot simply retreat because our queen would be lost. It's not so simple to get out of the pin either, because, for example, after the natural queen d4 move, which would move the queen out of the pin, the black queen would move all the way to the other side of the board and trap our bishop. So, not a good idea. Instead, moving our knight to b5 is another interesting try, but it would lead to getting into a second pin by bishop c6. Again, not the most ideal, not the best way. Try to think and figure out what should white do here. And here, white is able to use a little bit of tactic to get out of the pin and to simplify the position. And white continued by playing the queen to b5. White is offering the exchange of queens, and indeed black does not have much of a choice, because if black would try to avoid the exchange of queens, the bishop would be hanging on b7. So queen captured queen and knight captured back, very importantly at the same time protecting the bishop on a7. But at the moment it means that black gets to capture the pawn on e4 and win back one of the two extra pawns that white had. White traded rooks. And now, of course, followed up by moving the knight away from f3 before black would get the opportunity to trade the bishop for the knight on f3 and ruin white's pawn structure on the king side. Knight moved to d2, attacking the bishop on e4, and bishop to d3, attacking the knight on b5. Now, of course, there is only one move. If the knight would just move away to a random square, the bishop on a7 would be lost, so therefore knight e6 is pretty much a must. And now black chose to capture the bishop. Let's see how white continued in this technical endgame. Knight retreated to e4. Of course, much better than moving somewhere along the 8th rank, centralizing the knight, and typically it's not a good idea to go onto the enemy's territory when we're all surrounded by enemy pieces. Knight f8 came, and knight c5, an excellent square for the knight. Bishop returned to f5, and it's time to activate our second knight as well. Knight f3, came knight e6, and knight gets protected by the rook with rook to c1. And came king to f8. And now white was ready to trade knights. Bishop to back. And came knight to d4. With the idea to trade on e6 at the right moment, if black allows it. And black continued by playing rook to b7, attacking the pawn on b4. Of course, we're happy to advance the pawn to a protected square with b4, and black moved the bishop back to d7. And time to activate our king, and in order to do that most efficiently, white just played f4, opening the diagonal for the white king to march up. Came king e7 and king f2. Rook a7, attack the pawn. Of course, white simply protects it. As you can see, more and more of the white pieces appear on dark squares, making sure black's bishop doesn't get any targets. Came king to d6. White played rook d3, creating a discovery threat, forcing the black king to retreat. And the white king is ready to advance. Rook a4. A tricky move. Black's trap is that if the white king would advance to e4, black would get a tactical opportunity to get counterplay by playing c5, and after pawn takes, using the pin by giving a check on c6 and then capturing on g2. There's no need to give all these counter chances for black, and therefore in this position, white continued with rook c3, preventing any such ideas. King d6. And after a repetition of moves by rook d3 and rook c3 and king d6, of course white goes on and plays for the win and played knight e2. g6, rook d3 check, king e6, and of course the white king finally gets to advance, but through a dark square away from any checks from the black bishop. Came rook a6 and rook e3 check, king d6, and knight c3. As so often, to accomplish our strategical goals, we must use tactical elements. Just like here, the white pawn is indirectly protected. White can sacrifice that pawn, because if rook takes, then knight e4 check, discovery, and wins the rook. Black responded by f5, taking away the e4 square from the white knight, and now white finally is ready to advance the pawn. Again, if rook takes on a3, knight e4 check wins the rook. The rook retreated to a8 and came king c4, going to the queen side to aid the passed pawn on the a file. Came c5, en passant. The bishop moved back, knight b5 check, king c6, and rook to d3, with the idea to now get the rook to d6. Not much that black can do about it, and the rook appeared on d6. And now the best way is to take on g5 and then go behind the g pawn. And now black is losing a second pawn. The end of the game is very near. f4. And here, according to Capablanca, the best move was a4. Not that knight e4 is a real mistake either. Rook c8, threatening with a fork. There was no need to allow that. Came a check. King b6, rook g6, king b7. The knight went back. Knight d6. And finally, it's time to advance the passed pawns, and black resigned. A very nice technical game by Capablanca, simply hanging on to the material advantage, simplify the position, and then slowly but surely advance the passed pawns and win the game. Let's move on to a more current game that was played by Grandmaster Yusupov against Grandmaster Bunch. They have reached this position with white's clear material advantage. However, you always need to remember that a rook and bishop versus a rook with no pawns on the board typically is not enough to win the game. In this case, there are still pawns on the board, and that's quite crucial for white to keep at least one, or in this case, their last pawn. Obviously, what black is hoping to do, to give up even both pawns for white's last pawn. However, this is a typical example when you'd want to simplify, if you can, and reach a technically winning pawn endgame. And that's exactly what Yusupov did. He played g5, preparing for a transition to a winning pawn endgame. And there's nothing that black can do about it. Black played rook f5, and now white is ready to transpose by sacrificing actually a piece. Rook takes, and bishop takes, and king takes, and now the correct move is diagonal opposition, and black is facing a lost pawn endgame, because black keeps getting in zugzwang, needing to give up the opposition, and simply the white king is squeezing the black king off its defensive positions until the moment when they finally lose their pawn and then reach this easily winning pawn endgame. A very nice example. Let me share with you one of my own games that I played in the 2004 Chess Olympiad. Here we are. I have reached this position against a Polish player, and I have an extra pawn, but it's a double pawn on the f file. Another thing that goes for me is that my rook on the 7th rank is very, very active. I could capture the pawn on a7 right now, but then my opponent would capture my pawn on b2, and that certainly would not be a good trade. Also, it's important to recognize that if you'd imagine the queenside pawns disappearing, the A and B pawns on both sides disappearing, that pretty much would give black excellent drawing chances. Because 4 pawns versus 3 on the same side in most endgames, such as bishop versus knight or rook endgames or bishop endgames, are drawn. Not enough, not big enough of an advantage to win. Even less chances are when 2 of the pawns are doubled. In this case, I found a good idea to simplify the position and recognizing that black's most active piece is his rook on the second rank, I decided it's time to exchange that ideally placed black piece. Now, if black does not want to avoid losing his knight, he has no choice but to trade rooks. Of course, I recapture, and the attack on the black knight on d6, as well as the pawn on a7, is still on. If now black would choose to play knight c4 to counterattack against my b2 pawn, my answer would have been bishop b3, inviting the knight to capture the pawn so I can trap the knight. So black pretty much cannot do that. And if b5, then bishop takes knight, and rook takes pawn, and after rook b8, I would go after the pawn, maintaining my 2 extra pawns. Let's go back. After rook d1, my opponent traded, I took back, and she moved the knight to e4, not to c4. But of course, here again, I'm winning a second pawn. And again, a very important method when we're ahead, just simplify. I'm not saying that it's the very only way to win, but it's certainly the most thematical and the simplest. Black cannot avoid the exchange of the second pair of rooks either. And now, at this stage, it's definitely time to bring the king. King f1, king f8, and here I could advance my pawns, creating a passed pawn, a4, knight d4, and a5. Pawns got traded. King e7, pawn advance, king d6, and now it's time to go after black's kingside pawns. Bishop d5. Of course, the bishop is indirectly protected. The king doesn't have time to capture it because then the a7 pawn, a6 pawn to a7 would run away. Black played knight to b5, stopping the further advancement of the white a pawn, and in fact attacking the bishop on d5. I played bishop g8, h6, bishop h7, g5, forcing the black pawns to advance, and now finally I managed to get rid of my doubled pawn. Bishop d3, gaining tempo, knight a7, and the king is ready to march up and attack the black kingside pawns. In the meantime, the black knight is completely stuck, being busy holding off the a6 pawn. Came king e5, king f3. The plan is to march up to g4 and h5 and attack the pawn. Black pushed the pawn to prevent the white king in getting to g4, but I attack the pawn again, and when it advances, simply take, king g4, and I'm about to win a third pawn, and my opponent felt she've seen enough and resigned. Let's move on to our next example that was played by a Hungarian international master, Deli, against the legendary Viktor Korchnoi. In this position, black has just played a6, attacking the white knight on b5. One of those situations, one of those critical moments where white needs to make a decision whether to retreat or try to do something else. Of course, white would have some advantage also after simply retreating the knight to c3 and keep pressuring the pawn on d5, although it's not quite obvious how white will make further progress. Instead, white continued by a more ambitious but a bit risky trade on c6, followed by knight a7. Well, it's certainly ambitious. It immediately attacks the pawn on c6. But of course, you have to always double check and triple check a move like this that enters the knight into the enemy camp. As you can even visually see on the queenside upper part of the board, the white knight is fully surrounded by enemy pieces. White has to be careful, making sure the knight doesn't get trapped. In the meantime, the only way for black to defend the c6 pawn is by moving the bishop back to d7. And now, immediately, white can put further pressure on that pawn, namely by playing bishop a4. Now black is kind of stuck. The pawn cannot be protected another time. For example, if just black makes a random move like king h8, white can capture the pawn because after rook takes a7, white would play bishop d5. And after rook c7, bishop b6. Very cute. Let's go back. Because black, after bishop a4, played d4, trying to disconnect the white bishop on e3 from the knight on a7. And now knight took on c6 again, d takes e3, rook d7, rook d7, rook d7, bishop b2, and at the moment it's even material, but white was ready to attack the f7 pawn. And now black is in trouble. That pawn seems to be lost. Black tried an interesting trick, but doesn't quite work. Black played knight d6, protecting the pawn on f7, sacrificing the knight in hopes that the e-pawn would promote. e2, the rook now cannot catch the pawn, neither can the bishop or the knight, but the king can, just by stepping next to it. And now rook e8, again threatening to promote the pawn. If the white king would step on e1, trying to block the pawn's way, black immediately wouldn't have a check by giving bishop c3 check, forcing the king out of there and win the game. However, white has a saving move here by giving back the extra piece by playing bishop e6. A very important move, disconnecting the black rook from the pawn on e2. If black captures the bishop, the pawn on e2 will be lost and white will have an extra pawn and a technically winning position. Black played king g7 and knight d8, forcing the issue of the black pawn moving, pawn captured on e6, and now black is lost already. White in the game took the pawn on e2, although even better was to take the pawn on e6, followed by knight g5 check, and then again disconnecting the black rook from the pawn on e2, and then winning a second pawn on e2 and the game. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. This is an endgame composed by the famous composer Troitsky. If you look at the position, it's not hard to notice that black has a huge material advantage. At the same time, it's also important to recognize that the black king on e4 has not a single move at the moment. So if somehow white would be able to attack the king, that may be checkmate. But it's not easy to foresee how that may come about. In fact, it's white to move and win. The big question is how. Well, the first move is not very difficult. White should simply capture the pawn on e7 and threaten to crown a new queen. The only way that black can stop the promotion of the pawn is with the knight by moving it to c7. And now the bishop can remove the defender of the e8 square. Queen captures back. And here is the trouble. If now white simply promotes the pawn to a queen, black immediately can force a draw by perpetual checks, checking the king constantly from h7 and c7 back and forth. So this doesn't quite work. Amazingly, the only winning move is to under-promote, to promote the pawn to a knight. Beautiful. Amazingly, even though the black queen can go to a lot of different squares, all of them will result in losing the queen. I suggest you try all of them and see exactly where the fork will arrive from. Just to give you a couple of samples, if the queen goes to c8, knight d6. That's not difficult. If the queen goes to c5, it's more complex, but just a little bit. First we give a check, forcing the king into the forking position, and here it comes. Quite impressive. I suggest you test each one of those squares and see where the fork comes from. But what happens if the black queen moves to h7 with a check? Now there is certainly no fork. Not immediately, but even though it's black's turn now, there's nothing that black can do to avoid the upcoming fork. For example, after queen h8, knight d6, king e5, and knight f7. A beautiful domination of the knights over the black queen. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, learned about simplification, and of course enjoyed the amazing final position of the lesson. Thank you for listening. Hope you have you back next week.